Thanks so much for joining us today. We're welcoming now Elizabeth Burns-Thompson, serves as the Executive Director of the Modern Ag Alliance. Elizabeth, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me today.
You bet. So we've got a bill in the state of Mississippi introduced in the Senate, Senate Bill 2472. It's been extremely controversial, as you well know. I believe this was introduced by Senator Bryce Wiggins. And this bill would grant some form of immunity to the manufacturers of farm chemicals based on the labeling and so-called failure to warn. Commissioner Andy Gibson, Ag Commissioner, has suggested that he supports this legislation, but there's been an outcry from, I guess, the grassroots people in Mississippi that this would just give immunity to those who make these chemicals. They could just do as they see fit and not be responsible for any sort of injury. Tell us your position on this and what you think.
Sure. No, and I appreciate having the opportunity to set straight some of the misconceptions of what this bill does or doesn't do.
Okay.
We found that there's a lot of, I think, misunderstanding of what the language would implement. And at the end of the day, what this bill does is says that the label is the law. It recognizes the wealth of research and regulatory oversight that goes into those labels that's done by federal regulators, and ensures that remains consistent from state to state. Manufacturers are beholden to those requirements that come from the federal level, and frankly, this bill makes sure that manufacturers or companies are not being sued for following the law.
Okay, so this is where it got confusing to me when just reading the letter. I've got it in front of me from the commissioner. He says that the manufacturers could still be subject to legal liability if their products cause injury, regardless of what the label says. So what immunity is actually being provided, I guess, by this legislation?
Sure, and we would argue that it's not an immunity, not a liability shield,
Okay.
None of those. And I think the commissioner's letter that you're referencing does lay that out fairly clearly, right? So it basically what we've seen, and to kind of take a step back to where these conversations came from to begin with. I know listeners to your show pay attention to a lot of different kind of political moving pieces, and we've seen kind of politics of other states come in and unfortunately impact our ability to do things or farm, frankly, the way that we need to farm. And specifically, I draw the listeners' attention to Prop 65, which was an initiative out of the state of California that looked at attempting to put unwarranted labels on crop protection tools. Like what we're talking about today with this legislation. That was ultimately struck down, but we think that that's been just the start of where you have individuals, interest groups, the trial attorneys looking for ways to be able to undercut or really take tools out of the toolbox of the American farmer.
So maybe I'm oversimplifying this, Elizabeth, but what's the objection on the part of the manufacturers to just simply including some sort of warning as part of the label?
Frankly, I think it undercuts the necessity or the underpinnings of the label itself, right? We don't just randomly put things on labels. The makeup and the component pieces of that label are federally regulated. Everything that is on that label is put so with purpose and has an immense amount of science and justification behind it. You don't put things on label that could, maybe, might, we don't know. Everything on that label has specific justification. So we're following, we as in agriculture holistically is following that label to a T, be it the manufacturers that are producing that product, and then ultimately the farmers or applicators that are following kind of the application designations on that products as well, right? So where it can go, what rates, what crops, and the like, and also handling of that product too.
I guess I'm confused as to why we need a law. What's the purpose of the law? So the manufacturers don't want to put, some simple words on the label that says, hey, this stuff could do some bad and possibly cause whatever, do some sort of harm to people or the environment. They don't want to do that. And this bill, basically, the way I read it, says if they don't do that, but it still causes injury, according to what the commissioner says, you can still sue them. I'm not sure exactly what we need this legislation for. It's confusing.
So the purpose of the legislation is to take away from that confusion, right? Or to ensure that there is clarity from state to state that the federal label is the law. It is as simple as that. And so
Okay.
There's some conversation of, well, if we're talking about federal law, shouldn't this be a federal fix? And there are certainly things that we are talking to members of Congress about, as pathways that as well. But at the end of the day, when we're talking about these lawsuits, those are coming about as state level causes of action too. So that's in part why it's important that these are clarified at the state level. And again, this is a conversation that's obviously taking place in Mississippi. There are a number of state legislators that are having this very similar conversation, reviewing a very similar, if not identical, language. State capitals really almost coast to coast. In the first few weeks of my role here, we've been able to participate in those conversations in North Dakota and Missouri and Iowa, Mississippi, and many places in between. And really roll together. I think it's important that folks understand really the support and the entities and what is really at risk absent this type of legislation moving forward. And I'm from agriculture. Obviously, this is an agricultural conversation when we're talking about these types of tools, and to look at the cross-section of the agricultural community that has come together and supported this bill in the chamber thus far here in Mississippi and in legislatures really all across the country to date.
The perception in the public square is that what this bill attempts to do is just, again, provide this immunity and just keep people from suing these big multinational companies, even though they cause some sort of harm through use of their products, that this bill would shield them from that. I mean, that is the perception. I'm not sure the message is getting out to the public to understand, according to your description of it, that's not what it does exactly. And that's what the commissioner said as well in his letter.
I would agree. And I think that's in part why I really appreciate the opportunity to be on the show here today. Appreciate the remarks from the Ag Commissioner. We are trying to do as much as we can to try to bring attention to what the language actually does, which is codifies the federal regulatory process on pesticide labels. We are not taking away causes of action for lawsuits that are warranted. What we're working to do is to ensure that there are processes and consistency. Okay.
So we have a federal labeling process, right? We have standards. I guess, are those standards promulgated by the EPA? Are there other agencies involved in that as well?
Correct. So as it relates to ag pesticides, that sits within the United States EPA. And this is not just as simple as, maybe the label that we're used to seeing on the side of name your consumer product. These labels upwards take 12 to 15 years sometimes of the research that goes into the review of individual technologies, that being done, by the manufacturers, by the regulatory entity itself, independent researchers as well. So all of those things coming together before a product can even be brought to market. And I think it's also important to note that isn't just a snapshot in time, right? These products are re-reviewed at least every 15 years. And I highlight specifically the at least portion because we know, even just looking back at the history of one of the most widely used particular chemistries in this space, glyphosate, which I know is on the top of many folks' mind. Particular technology has been used safely for 50 years. It's been successfully re-registered a variety of times and reviewed even more so in that 15-year window in each of those buckets. Not just in this country, but I think it's important to note, these types of tools are also being used all around the world and subject to reviews and regulatory oversight in each of those jurisdictions, and to date, has successfully been re-registered.
I got you. Well, we're out of time here today, but I did want to pass this on. I've been working with a company that down in Florida that has created some chemical-free, some all-natural pesticides and herbicides and microbials. It's called Clear Green. Maybe something you guys want to check out. They've been testing it with the state of Florida. Seems like it may be a way to appease everyone and address this problem. But Elizabeth, really appreciate you joining us today. Very insightful, and we'll keep an eye on this legislation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me today.
You bet. Elizabeth Burns-Thompson, Executive Director of the Modern Ag Alliance, has been our guest. Coming right back.